Team Yugi kicks off with one of the premier cards of Yugi's deck, especially in the early parts of the anime, Summon Skull, making his mark against Pegasus twice, Weevil, the Paradox Brothers, Mai, Joey, Rebecca, Bandit, Keith, the Exodia Rare Hunter, and then in the Yugi Pharaoh duel, and in non-dueling appearances like Virtual World, Waking the Dragons, and Capsule Monsters. Quite the resume for a card that follows it up with inequitable card game credentials to boot, being for so long the strongest one tribute monster in the game, which made it a staple in the early days. Of course, it has easily been power crept by cards and archetypes that run the duel with effects rather than brute strength, but Summon Skull hasn't been forgotten, receiving various alternate artwork and even some support here and there, such as 4 boss monsters that all take on the name Summon Skull when on the field, and an older card in Makiu, the Magical Mist, which, quite frankly, has also been power crept if it was ever not power crept to begin with. But given the storied legacy in both the show and card game, let's see what we can make from these bones. The premise of the Summon Skull deck is twofold. First, the various monsters designed for this deck are skull versions of existing cards, much like how Evil Swarm are evil versions of existing cards. The other premise is having monsters that can take on the name of Summon Skull, so you can access the effects of cards that require Summon Skull to work. This is an extension of the aforementioned Archfiend cards that were released somewhat recently, but turning it into something more cohesive. Up first is Crusher the Skull Warrior, the skull version of Breaker the Magical Warrior. He shares the same effect where instead of getting a spell counter on summon, he gets a skull counter. His other effect is to remove a skull counter to destroy a spell or trap, and if he does that, his name becomes Summon Skull and he's treated as a level 6 monster, which, as mentioned previously, allows him to work with Summon Skull specific support as well as being able to go into rank 6 or level 7 synchro plays, which we'll soon see. Next is Skull Kid, the skull version of Alien Kid. His effect is different from the alien version. What he does is once he hits the next turn standby phase, he's all grown up and now treated as a level 6 Summon Skull. The next monster is Skull Trooper, the skull version of Card Trooper. He can send 1 to 3 cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard, then becomes a level 6 Summon Skull if any of those cards were an Archfiend card. And in addition, he also gains 500 attack per card that you send. The final main deck monster is the skull version of Glow Up Bulb, Glow Up Skull. His Glow Up Bulb type effect is to mill a card, and if that's an Archfiend card, you can special summon him from the grave, but he can only be summoned like that once per duel. He also takes on the name Summon Skull when sent from the field to the graveyard. This card, being a tuner, allows you to synchro summon, which brings us to the boss monster of the deck, Unleashed Summon Skull. So Unleashed Summon Skull is one heck of a monster, a level 7 synchro that requires Glow Up Skull and any number of non-tuner fiend monsters. He's treated as Summon Skull on the field, but it's his quick effect that makes him formidable. You can send any spell that specifically lists Summon Skull in its card text from your deck to the graveyard and resolve his effect as the effect of that spell. Of course, this effect can only be activated during a main phase. As we get through the spells, you'll find that this can be incredibly powerful when activated at the right time. The one caveat is that you have to meet the activation requirement of that spell. So it's not like Diamond Dude where you just resolve the effect, but rather you need to be able to achieve the cost and conditions attached to the spell in order to balance out this effect. But before we get to the spells, we do have one more extra deck monster, and that is Leviair the Sea Skull, the skull version of Leviair the Sea Serpent. It's a rank 3 Xyz monster that requires 2 level 3 Fiend monsters and can summon a banished Archfiend monster, but it is destroyed in the end phase. The thing about this Leviair is that detaching is part of the effect, not a cost, which makes it work very well with the little booger that already exists called Archfiend Eris, a card that has huge synergies with this deck because it can basically search out anything since Skull is treated as Archfiend. Any card with Skull in its name is treated as an Archfiend card. And of course, we can't forget Tour Guide from the Underworld, who is a 1-card combo into Leviair whenever you need it. Alright, now we get into the spells. First up, we have the Searcher of the deck, Bone Chest. This is one of the few cards in the deck that is not a Skull card, so it doesn't take on the name Archfiend either, nor does it work with cards that require a Skull or Archfiend card such as Glow Up Skull and Archfiend Eris. Instead, it searches out a card that mentions Summon Skull from your deck and then can turn any monster on the field into a level 6 Summon Skull monster. So it can get you any combo piece you need, and then open up even more combos for the cards that work with Summon Skull, which are the rest of the ones that we're about to show. First up, we have Extra Skull. This is a card that trades in one Summon Skull you control for an extra deck monster that either lists Summon Skull as a material or in its card text. This can be a quick way to go into any of the Summon Skull support Konami has released, and even call back to Black Skull Dragon if you want it. Next we have Skull Crush. This is a skull version of a card known as Gemini Spark, where you tribute a Summon Skull monster to target a card and destroy it, and if you do, you draw a card. Another quick play spell to help you utilize your Summon Skull that are being threatened by your opponent, and a quick way to get rid of anything you need to pop at a moment's notice. Next we have Skull Reborn, the monster reborn of the deck that allows you to special summon any monster named Summon Skull from your graveyard, as long as it's a monster that can otherwise be normal summoned. This turns your graveyard into a toolbox since all the Skull monsters take on the name Summon Skull while in the graveyard, whether that be bringing out a Crusher to pop back row, or a Glow Up Skull for another synchro play, or just good old Summon Skull for plays in that regard. Next we have Skull Summon. This is a card that accomplishes two major things. It gets out Summon Skull, and it sends an Archfiend card to the graveyard from your deck. For those of you following along, you know this means that this card is likely a one-card move into Unleash Summon Skull by cheating out Summon Skull to the field and dumping Glow Up Skull into your graveyard. Next we have Makiu the Skull Mist, a card that lets you turn off all monster effects for the turn except a single Summon Skull. So a much improved version of the original Makiu card, and it being a card that you can use with Unleash Summon Skull, it helps you turn off monster effects on your opponent's turn as well. And finally, we have Summon Skull's signature attack from the show Lightning Strike. This is a normal spell that can only be activated if you control Summon Skull, and it destroys all cards on the field not named Summon Skull. Like Bone Chest, it's not searchable, but like Bone Chest and other spells, it can be used with Unleash Summon Skull to blow up your opponent's field during their main phase. There's only one trap in this deck, and it is a counter trap. It's called Skull and Crossbones, whereby you can banish any Summoned Skull from your graveyard to negate the summon or effect that summons any non-Summoned Skull monster. So basically any effect that would summon anything that's not specifically Summoned Skull. In addition to being a powerful negate, it allows you to banish things for Leviair the Sea Skull to grab later. So that does it for the Summoned Skull support. Hope you enjoyed. Would love to hear anything you'd add or change about this deck. And make sure you like and subscribe. Next up, we'll go into the first Kaiba monster. You might say he leaves a calling card.